All right, August 25th, 2020, Tuesday, 9:18 p.m. Central Standard. This article was published by Science Alert in the health section. Let's check out the photo here. All right, and what does the caption say? Human plasma transfer by Sudak1 from Getty Images. Title reads, a 100-year-old treatment has been approved for COVID-19 in the U.S. Here's how it works. Looks like this article was published today by Aria Bendix from the Business Insider, published on the 25th of August, 2020 today. During the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, doctors discovered they could treat sick patients with the blood of those who had already recovered. This already sounds like a problem, but I'm going to continue. The therapy known as convalescent plasma helped reduce mortality among people with acute infections. Now the FDA has issued an emergency authorization for the therapy's use among COVID-19 patients. Antibodies develop in plasma, the liquid portion of blood. They're part of our body's natural response to a foreign pathogen. So the idea behind the treatment is to help sick people mount an antibody response to the virus by transferring plasma intravenously from those who already have antibodies. What we really need are drugs that, when given early, can prevent a symptomatic person from requiring hospitalization or very dramatically diminish the time that they're symptomatic. Dr. Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, told Facebook founder last month. Convalescent plasma is especially promising in that regard. You guys, I'm finding this harder and harder to believe as I go. 100 years ago, they didn't have HIV. It's a lot of things they didn't have. I don't know if that's transferred through plasma. Let's just continue. The emergency use authorization from the FDA will allow doctors to administer the treatment earlier in the course of an infection, when it's believed to be most effective. The agency was expected to authorize plasma treatment last week, but it was briefly delayed after federal health officials, including Fauci, called for more data from randomized controlled trials. The New York Times reported, yeah, this definitely sounds terrible to me. So if you catch the coronavirus, or maybe even if you don't catch it, they're willing to inject you with the plasma of someone who has already caught coronavirus and has survived it. I think that would be a major issue, because I think there are already different strains of coronavirus as it is. So, I just think that would create more problems. I don't see how that's going to solve the issue. Maybe that worked for the Spanish flu in 1918, but this is 2020. I'm going to try to stick to the article, you guys. Dr. Thomas File, president of the Infectious Disease Society of America. I didn't even know there was an Infectious Diseases Society of America. Where did they come up with this stuff? Said the available data on the treatment is still insufficient. While the data to date shows some positive signals that convalescent plasma can be helpful in treating individuals with COVID-19, especially if given early in the trajectory of disease, we lack the randomized controlled trial data we need to better understand its utility in COVID-19 treatment, he said in a statement on Sunday. As of Monday, more than 2,700 hospitals have already administered plasma therapy through an expanded access program led by the Mayo Clinic. The program has delivered plasma to more than 100,000 patients, according to the program website. However, there are still major limitations to plasma therapy's widespread use. Plasma must be transferred quickly from a donor to a recipient, and both must have compatible blood types. The quantity is also limited since it depends on blood donations. That means plasma isn't likely to be a long-term treatment for the virus. Let me say that again. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a scientist. I don't work for what was that up there at the top again? The International Disease Control. What was that? I don't work for the Infectious Diseases Society of America. But I was able to surmise and come to the conclusion that means plasma isn't likely to be a long-term treatment for the virus. Instead, researchers and pharmaceutical companies see it as an interim therapy until a vaccine becomes readily available. So the interim therapy is injecting plasma from people who have already had COVID-19. So injecting coronavirus contaminated plasma into other people. You know, I'm just not seeing, I'm not seeing the healing going on here. But let's continue on. Early research shows promise. I find that very hard to believe. A national study of 35,000 hospitalized coronavirus patients, which is still awaiting peer review, found that patients less than 80 years old who weren't on a respirator and received plasma containing high levels of antibodies within 3 days of their diagnosis had a 35% lower mortality rate than those who were treated 4 or more days after their diagnosis. In a White House briefing on Sunday, Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar called this a major advance in the treatment of patients. But researchers would ideally need to compare patients who receive plasma with untreated patients to know whether the therapy really impacts survival. A MACE study from researchers at Mount Sinai, which is still awaiting peer review, found that hospitalized coronavirus patients who received convalescent plasma had a higher chance of survival than those who didn't receive the treatment. Only 18% of the plasma recipients saw their conditions worsen 2 weeks after their transfusion, compared to 24% of patients who didn't receive the treatment. I'm going to read that again. Only 18% of the plasma recipients saw their conditions worsen 2 weeks after the transfusion, compared to 24% of patients who did not receive the treatment. I'm not seeing the win here, you guys. Maybe someone can clue me in. I'm not seeing the win here. 18% versus 24%, I'm not seeing the win. By May 1st, nearly 72% of the plasma recipients had been discharged from the hospital compared to 67% of the other patients. Let me read that again. By May the 1st, nearly 72% of the plasma recipients had been discharged from the hospital compared to 67% of the other patients. That's literally 5% more. Do you guys see that? 67% versus 72%. That tells you right that tells you right there that this is doing nothing. You have a 5% increase? What the hell is that going to do? It's a pandemic here. Moving forward, but the study was small. Only 39 patients received transfusions, and the results were only significant for patients who didn't need a ventilator. In another study, also not yet peer-reviewed, researchers at the Mayo Clinic found that convalescent plasma reduced the mortality rate among hospitalized coronavirus patients by 57%. Most research so far has suggested that patients treated earlier in the course of their infection have better outcomes. A recent study of 316 patients at Houston Methodist hospitals found that patients who received plasma transfusions within 72 hours of being admitted to the hospital had a lower risk of mortality over the next 28 days than patients who received transfusions after 72 hours had passed. We now have more evidence than ever that this century-old plasma therapy has merit, is safe, and can help reduce the death rate from this virus, Dr. James Musser, chair of the Department of Pathology and Genomic Medicine at Houston Methodist, said in a statement. Why are all of these hospitals all like Methodist hospitals and Christian hospitals? Has anyone ever noticed that? It's always like some type of Christian hospital. So they're saying they now have more evidence than ever that this century old plasma therapy. Okay, listen, if the plasma therapy worked so great 100 years ago, why has it not been being used up until now 100 years later? Question. Mayo Clinic researchers also determined that the treatment was relatively safe among 5,000 adults with severe or life-threatening cases. Less than 1% of the patients developed severe side effects within 4 hours of receiving a blood transfusion. Although transfusions always pose some risk to seriously ill patients, only 4 deaths were linked to the plasma therapy. Drug companies are converting plasma into medicine. In May, a coalition of medical institutions, drug companies, nonprofits, and COVID-19 survivors launched The Fight Is In Us, a campaign to get more recovered coronavirus patients to donate blood. Wow. Okay, that sounds like a terrible idea. Some of that blood will be used for direct transfusions, and the rest will go toward manufacturing hyperimmune globulin, a drug built for convalescent plasma. Why do I say that's a terrible idea? Because I was just seeing some articles where some people are being reinfected with the coronavirus. I'll continue. The process of creating hyperimmune globulin involves pooling plasma from recovered patients and heat treating it so that any remaining pathogens get destroyed. The result is a vial of medicine with consistent antibody levels that can easily be administered to patients. The drug focuses on the most common antibodies found in blood, immunoglobulin, GIGG, which usually confers long-term immunity. It's basically treated in a way that reduces the likelihood that it could pass on any infections. David Reich, President and Chief Operating Officer of the Mount Sinai Hospital, told Business Insider in April, something like that could be helpful, potentially to people in the early phase of the disease or potentially as prophylaxis against the disease. Mount Sinai is working with Emergent Biosolutions, a Maryland-based biopharmaceutical company, to develop a hyperimmune globulin product. The group will study whether the drug can protect individuals at high risk of exposure, such as healthcare workers, from getting infected in the first place. A coalition of 10 drug companies involved in the Fight Is In Us campaign is also creating a hyperimmune globulin drug. The research is led by Takeda, Japan's largest pharmaceutical company, and CSL Behring, a Pennsylvania-based biotech company. They're hoping to determine whether hyperimmune globulin improves outcomes for coronavirus patients with severe cases. Our goal here isn't to continue to produce hyperimmune globulin ad infinitum. Christopher Morabito, head of research and development for plasma-based therapies at Takeda, previously told Business Insider, "Our goal here is to have an effective therapy to bridge us to a point where either the pandemic is over because it dies out, or because there's a vaccine available, or until there are many more effective treatments for patients with this disease." The coalition hopes to secure regulatory approval from the FDA by the end of 2020. But there are plenty of hurdles. Drug quantities are still limited by the quantity of plasma people donate. Companies researching hyperimmune globulin and direct convalescent plasma treatments also still need to prove that the approaches are safe. This story has been updated with new information. It was originally published on August 11, 2020. Okay, all right. I'm not a scientist. I am not a physician. However, this sounds like a terrible idea. I'm going to go ahead and close it out here. You guys comment and let me know your thoughts.